Here's a question that baffled me for years. Why does the GMAT allow GMAT Club to copy their questions? And I thought, wow, what a serious violation of copyright law. And for a very long time I thought it's because it's just too much of a pain to actually go and chase them around and make them take these questions down. And that's the reason that I thought that they had. And then I finally realized why they actually don't care that different websites copy their questions. I don't think they even care that different test web companies clone their questions. And cloning is when a test web company looks at a GMAT question and then tweaks it a little bit so that the wording is different, the numbers are different, but ultimately the essence of the question, or what makes that question difficult, and the nuance of that clever thing that makes the question hard, is copied. Now I finally understand that the GMAT actually don't really care. In fact, they prefer that test web companies copy their questions, clone their questions, and put them on these forums for people to solve them for free. It actually makes the exam a better exam. And so here's what I finally understood. And I had to go on ChatGPT and do this search, and I asked the following question. What proportion of the revenue that the GMAT makes is actually from these official materials? So the official guides, the mock tests, the extra guides, and what proportion of the revenue is from the actual exam? And if you're clever, you would have guessed it right. The largest proportion of the revenue comes from people actually sitting down and solving the exam in the test center or online. And a very small proportion comes from these extra guides, these official guides, these mock tests that you actually purchase to prepare. That is a very small proportion of the revenue. But the question remains, why don't they care that they're losing that money? Because it makes their exam a lot more valuable. So here's what you have to remember. These questions, the official questions that you solve, or the mock tests that you solve on their website, their purpose is, number one, to assess your progress. So if you are someone who solves a lot of these questions on these platforms, for example, the GMAT Club or other forums, you're burning through questions that are very rare, that are very unique, whose actual purpose is to identify your weaknesses in quantitative and verbal reasoning and then improve. And once you've identified those weaknesses, actually work on solving and improving those weaknesses, and then using whatever part of those questions that are remaining to actually calibrate and frame your quantitative and verbal reasoning in a manner that is going to be rewardful for the exam. Okay, those questions that you're looking at in the official guide, they're not to learn math. They're not to learn how to solve a GMAT question. They are not for the purpose of learning, hey, what is the theory behind number properties? What is the theory behind counting? Let me learn the theory by applying all these questions. This is not what these questions are for. These are questions that you have to look at as mini mock tests or mini drills or interval training that you use to make sure that you are calibrating whatever knowledge that you have already about quantitative reasoning and verbal reasoning in the context of a GMAT question. That is what it's for, to identify your flaws in reasoning and to think, wait a minute, I'm not executing, I'm not solving those questions in the manner that I'm supposed to be solving. Okay, this question, this set allowed me to identify these errors. Let me work on that and let me improve it. That is how you need to use those questions. And relatively speaking, if you're starting from a score that is an average score and you want to go to a much higher score, it is an absolute waste to solve these questions before you improve your quantitative reasoning and your verbal reasoning. And so what happens when you go on these platforms and you actually solve a lot of these questions when you're not ready to solve these questions, okay, they're still above the level that is required to really extract all the value that you can out of those questions. Those questions are not for learning. Those questions are for applying. Those questions are for calibrating your quantitative and verbal reasoning process within the context of a GMAT test. And so when you don't do that, and you burn through these questions too fast before you've developed your quantitative and verbal reasoning, you've compromised a tool a very valuable tool that is available for you to do that, and there aren't many questions left. And so it is amazing for the GMAT that there are these forums and then there are these platforms where people can solve these questions and waste them and burn through them, because it will make their test that more valuable. And that is why I finally answer those questions. They don't want people to really figure out proper quantitative and verbal reasoning. They don't want people to extract all the value that they can out of those questions, because if they do, the exam is going to be a lot easier. And that is precisely why they tell you, go ahead, solve these questions. We don't really care, because the real moneymaker for them is the actual test. So what does that mean for you? Do not waste official material. Do not waste mock tests. Do not go on platforms and solve those questions on those platforms. You will waste them. Instead, what you need to do is first start by understanding if you're scoring below a 605 or a 595 or a 585, and your goal is to really hit 645, 655 plus, do not touch these questions when you begin preparing for the GMAT. Or if you've been stuck on a certain score for a while, leave these questions alone. Because the reason that you're not able to improve your score and you're stuck on a score, and the reason that you're stuck on a very low score, is that your fundamentals of quantitative and verbal reasoning and your reading comprehension core is weak. It's not strong enough and it's not developed enough, and therefore this means if you solve these official questions, you're going to waste them and you will not extract the value that you can out of those questions. Instead, you need to first develop your quantitative and verbal reasoning skill. You need to develop your reading comprehension foundation. You need to develop your mathematical foundation. And once you've arrived to a point where you're autonomous and you have mastered the concepts that they assess, then you use these official questions with caution to refine your quantitative and verbal reasoning and to calibrate the process that you've developed solving these questions within the context of a GMAT question.